please welcome to the stage our next speaker, John Hagel, co-founder of the Deloitte Center for the Edge.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here today. I first came to Silicon Valley 30 years ago, and I fell in love with Silicon Valley on so many levels. One of the levels was definitely plays in the Valley, and as a liberal arts guy, at first it was very hard for me to engage around technology, but I rapidly began to see the potential. And there's a certain protocol in Silicon Valley in any talk on technology, which is you start out by saying technology is going to change the world, for the better, of course, and then you explore in the rest of the talk how the vast improvements that are going to occur. I'm actually going to start with a focus on the challenges that are being created by information technology, the dark side, if you will, which doesn't often get talked about. One of the things that I think is an indicator, broadly the proposition is that information technology intensifies pressure, competitive pressure on all of us, and it will continue to intensify pressure on an ongoing basis for the foreseeable future. One of the pieces of evidence for that is something that we looked at, which was a fairly basic question, which is just how are companies doing? And not just in the most recent quarter or the most recent year, but over a reasonably long period of time. How are companies doing? And what we ended up looking at were all public companies in the United States, not just a small sample, but every public company, over a reasonably long period of time, since 1965. And in that time period, what we saw was, if you take as a basic measure of performance, return on assets, and there are issues with that, but we think it's a reasonable proxy. If you look at return on assets since 1965, return on assets has collapsed. It's declined by 75%. It's been a sustained and significant erosion in profitability. Of course, there are cycles along the way, but there's a long-term trend. There is absolutely no sign of it leveling off. There is certainly no sign of it turning around. So mounting performance pressure over a very long period of time. Increasingly, when I go into executive boardrooms, the metaphor I hear, the image I get, is of the Red Queen. The Red Queen running faster and faster just to stay in the same place. I actually think that's an optimistic view of the world we're in. The Red Queen ran faster and faster and stayed in the same place. We're running faster and faster and falling farther and farther behind. So I think that's the challenge that is in front of us as a society, and I think this is happening on a global basis as well as just in the U.S. But I wanted to focus specifically on the implications for women of all of this. I think one of the issues is there has been bias, and there still is bias against women in the workplace. I think in a time of increasing economic pressure, bias tends to intensify. It's worse than that because I think in a time of increasing pressure, what you see emerge among executives, and largely male executives, is a metaphor, an image of we're in war. This is about war. This is a zero-sum game. If we win, somebody else has to lose. If somebody else wins, we're going to lose. We can't afford to lose. And so what you get is an emphasis on what I would call, for lack of a better word, a masculine archetype. The masculine archetype says we're in war. We can't afford to invest in emotion. This is not about emotion. Put emotion to the side. It's about you can't show vulnerability. This is about showing strength, projecting strength at all times. You have to be deeply analytical. You have to apply rational analysis to all things, and you have to do that by pulling things apart and analyzing in great detail the individual components. And you need to, based on that understanding that you achieve through analysis, you need to move aggressively and ruthlessly into the marketplace to win. That's a masculine archetype. And I think in that kind of mindset, the natural conclusion is what we need are a few good men, and if women want to play, they need to adopt this masculine archetype. The only way to succeed is by adopting that archetype. And I think that's exactly the wrong kind of conclusion to draw from the mounting pressure that we're in. It avoids the question of why has this pressure been mounting? Because I think what's interesting about it is at one level it's been about intensifying competition. Competition, by one measure, has doubled over this time period since 1965, intensity of competition. But something much more fundamental has occurred. We have seen over this time period a long-term big shift in terms of the basis of competition. And there are many ways to characterize that basis. One way of characterizing it is moving from stocks to flows. What do I mean by that? In the 20th century, we grew up in a world, a business world, where it was all about developing proprietary knowledge stocks. You basically developed something that nobody else knew, had access to. You aggressively protected access to that knowledge stock, and then you, as efficiently as possible, extracted value from that knowledge stock. Huge companies were created, enormous wealth generated. The problem in a world of increasingly rapid change and more uncertainty is whatever knowledge stocks you have today are depreciating at an accelerating rate. Whatever you know today is diminishing in value at an ever more rapid rate. And the only way you succeed in that kind of world is to move to a focus on knowledge flows. Participating in flows of new knowledge, more diverse flows, richer flows, larger number of flows of knowledge. And I wanted to unpack that just a little bit because I think the issue, when I talk in Silicon Valley about knowledge flows, typically the image that gets generated is large databases floating through cyberspace. And that's certainly one element of flow, and I don't want to diminish that. But the paradox is that at a time when we have more and more data and information, the knowledge that's most valuable is what I would call tacit knowledge. It's the knowledge that we all have in our heads that we have a very hard time expressing, even to ourselves, much less to anybody else. It's the new experiences that we've just had. We haven't had a chance to really process it. We're not quite sure what the meaning is of it. We certainly haven't categorized it and put it into neat buckets of information. So knowledge, tacit knowledge is key. The challenge is tacit knowledge doesn't flow very easily. In fact, it's sticky. We have a very hard time expressing it even to ourselves. It's very hard to engage in the effort and the potential embarrassment of trying to articulate that tacit knowledge to somebody else. And we're only going to do that if we're in a trust-based relationship. If there's deep trust between two people or among a group of people, you will start to see tacit knowledge be shared. But in the absence of that trust, you're not going to get much access to tacit knowledge, if any. And I think the challenge gets even deeper because what you're talking about is not just a few trust-based relationships, but if you take this notion of knowledge flows seriously, it's lots and lots of trust-based relationships, scaling that to large groups of people. So the winners in this new world are those who build very large numbers of rich flows of tacit knowledge, or riding on the rails of trust-based relationships. Now I come back to this notion of a masculine archetype. Is that masculine archetype about this is a zero-sum game, we are at war, going to be the kind of archetype that will facilitate those knowledge flows? I would suggest no. In fact, it will deeply undermine those knowledge flows. And what we need is a different kind of archetype, and let me, for convenience, call it a feminine archetype. Feminine archetype starts with the notion that the world is about relationships. It's not about transactions. The masculine archetype is everything is a transaction. Buy low, sell high, squeeze as much as you can, move on. In this new world, it's about relationships, not transactions. It's about the notion of these relationships being long-term, sustained relationships, where the kind of communication that occurs in the relationship is not around data sets and graphs of charts of data. It's around stories. It's around stumbling around to try to express yourself. It's about images. It's about visual kinds of communication. I'm struck that whenever I go out to the edge to look at what's happening in terms of sharing knowledge, you see a proliferation of conferences. And what happens in those conferences is people are coming together not to go through slide decks. They're coming together to tell stories and to learn from each other from those stories and to build relationships in those conferences. So I think it's an interesting observation that in that kind of world, we're looking for relationships that are trust-based, where the communication is quite different. It's not around analytic categories, it's around stories. We're looking at situations where you want to bring in emotion and intuition into the relationship. You want to express vulnerability in the relationship, because I guarantee you will not build trust without expressing vulnerability. So if you're in that masculine archetype of project a strong image at all times, you will not be successful in building trust. You have to be willing to express vulnerability. And so I think it raises a very different kind of archetype that's going to be required for success in this new world. And I think that over time, the opportunity it creates, it's not just that we're shifting the basis of competition, and so if we adopt this new archetype, we will get back to where we were. I actually believe that as part of this big shift, and it's some of the research that we've been pursuing, as part of this big shift, we are for the first time on the cusp of an opportunity to move from a business world that has historically been a diminishing returns world in terms of performance curves. If you look at any industry market over the past century, in terms of performance improvement, it has been a diminishing returns curve. A famous consulting firm developed a reputation around one chart. It's called the experience curve. And it was a very accurate description of how performance improves in industry after industry. But I think we're now on the cusp of a world where we can, through a different set of archetypes, practices, institutions, actually turn that experience curve on its side and make it an increasing returns curve, where the more people who participate, the faster everybody learns, the more rapidly performance improves. A completely different world, enormous wealth to be created around the world. This is a global, I think, again, phenomenon that we're talking about. So in summary, I would make the proposition that the future belongs to the feminine archetype, not the masculine archetype. And that those of us who adopt the feminine archetype, male or female, are going to be the ones to create that wealth and enjoy the enormous success ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Next, we have to the stage Dominique Crenn, chef de cuisine Luz at